The cold wind put Layla's face as she stared into the black horizon. This was not the typical trip to her mom's and dad's house. The deserted roadways, the outright darkness swallowing her old Golf's front lights, and the expanding sense of privacy were all that surrounded her. She ought to have been at her parents' residence before dark, but a sudden engine breakdown had postponed her for hours. Now, the clock showed 11 during the night, and she was stranded on a desolate rural road. No phone signal, no human being in sight. Layla, in her late 20s, had chestnut hair and almond eyes that normally mirrored a vivid, adventurous spirit. Yet tonight, her eyes were filled with concern. She had always been autonomous, accustomed to dealing with issues smoothly and rationally. However, this roadway was different. It was wrapped up in an absolute silence, broken only by the murmur of the wind and the friction of her vehicle tires on the crumbling asphalt. She remembered her grandma's cautions concerning this certain road. Old stories concerning lost hearts and eternal tourists who never ever reached their location. Layla had constantly made fun of these tales, but now, with every mile she drove, those stories took on a new measurement of scary. Suddenly, the dashboard lights started to flicker hugely. After that, they passed away. The automobile's engine did the same with an abrupt and frightening halt. Silence returned, deeper and much heavier this time. Layla tried to begin the cars and truck repetitively, but to no avail. She quit trying, pushed the door open, and marched right into the night. The air was cold and biting, bringing a strange fragrance, a mix of moist earth and another thing, something metal, like the smell of old blood. She checked out. The darkness was so thick that she could not see past a few meters of her cars and trucks' dark lights, which quickly went out entirely, leaving her in absolute blackness. A feeling of utter loneliness engulfed her. The darkness accepted her like a chilly shroud. She understood she had no choice but to stroll. Probably she would certainly find a nearby community, or at the very least, a deserted cabin where she could spend the night. She got hold of a small flashlight from her bag, a heavy wrench, and her tiny purse, and began walking along the dark roadway. Every action increased her heartbeat. The dry leaves on either side of the road rustled gently with each gust of wind, like mystical whispers. Only a few minutes passed prior to the flashlight began to lower. The batteries were almost dead. Layla stopped, cursed her good luck, and attempted to see in the pitch black. Because moment, she saw something. A really faint light in the distant perspective, barely visible, as if rising from a small house home window. A glimmer of hope. Layla drew new stamina from this light and began to stroll faster, identified to reach it. The closer she obtained, the extra she saw that the light didn't appear ahead from a normal residence. It was periodic, like a flicker. Then she started to listen to a noise, a pale sound at first, after that more clear with each step. It was the sound of weeping, a youngster's cry. Blood froze in her veins. That could be a child crying in this barren area at such a late hour? The light and now the audio were coming from an old, worn-out shack alongside the road, almost concealed among thick trees. The shack looked abandoned, its windows broken, its door hanging off its joints. Yet the crying increased from within. And beside the door, she saw something disposed of on the ground. An old doll, its eyes missing, its smile altered and stained with what appeared like red mud. Layla really felt a reaction, alerting her to steer clear of. An instinct yelling to transform and run. However, the audio of crying tore at her heart. Existed a youngster at risk? She hesitated for a moment. After that, made an eventful choice. She convinced herself that perhaps a person required help, possibly a mishap. This sense of duty conquered the reaction of fear. Layla slowly came close to the shack, holding the wrench up as a flimsy shield. Each step taxed her. The air grew chillier, and the scent of old blood became stronger, blended with the smell of something else. Something rotten, as if something had actually been decaying inside the shack for a long time. As she got to the falling apart entryway, the crying unexpectedly quit. Outright silence. Layla peered right into the utter darkness of the shack. She saw nothing at first, only black shadows and webs. Then she heard a sound, a barely audible sound, like a whisper, yet it was not a kid's murmur. It was a deep, guttural voice, as if coming from a throat that did not belong to a human. "You finally come." The voice reverberated within the dark shack, rugged and cool as mountain rocks. It wasn't an echo. It was straight, as if the shack itself was talking. Layla iced up in position, the wrench still absurdly elevated. She couldn't see anything, simply absolute darkness swallowing all light, as if the human eye had no power to permeate it. The smell of degeneration and old blood became suffocating, tightening up around her throat, as if attempting to choke her. "That are you?" Layla asked, her voice hardly a murmur, combined with anxiety and defiance. Her heart battered violently versus her ribs, as if attempting to tear its way out. A deep, guttural, ruthless laugh echoed. It seemed like rattling bones, or the grinding of enormous stones. "Me? I have actually been below, considering that this roadway was just a trace of shed steps. I am all that tourists have actually lost, every sigh of anguish, every spirit that never found its way home." Layla began to really feel something relocating the darkness. It had not been the audio of footprints, yet a sense of the air moving, something crawling, slowly approaching her. She couldn't construct its type, but the sensation of absolute wickedness was palpable, heavy, weighing down on her breast. She took a go back. However, something bumped her foot. She overlooked, or tried to see, and recognized she almost fell into a dark pit located straight inside the shack's entryway. "Where's the child?" Layla asked, attempting to concentrate on why she came, on the weeping that had led her to this hell. The crawling quit. The youngster? The voice duplicated with a sarcastic tone, as if the word rejected to leave its impressive mouth. "Do not you see? The youngster is you." Everybody that enters this location ends up being a youngster, lost, worried, sobbing soundlessly. At that moment, Layla really felt a cold, completely dry, bony hand touch her shoulder. It wasn't a human hand. It was as well long, with sharp claw-like nails. A scream caught in her throat, and she pushed with all her might, trying to escape. She fell onto the asphalt outside the shack, the wrench slipping from her understanding. She attempted to creep away, her mind shrieking to take off. Yet the shack would certainly not allow her run away so quickly. Instantly, the dead tree branches bordering the shack started to go on their very own, like thick arms expanding from the darkness. Some twisted around her feet, holding her securely. Layla tried to shriek, yet no noise appeared. The shack was absorbing every little thing, even her weeps. The important things inside the shack slowly began to arise. It had no definite form, but was more like a mass of thick darkness that developed and changed, changing right into long, distorted limbs. After that, shrinking back once more. Its eyes, if it had eyes, were two pale red, beautiful factors in the heart of the darkness, staring at her mercilessly. "You cannot leave, Layla," the voice stated, more detailed now, as if whispering in her ear. "You are now part of the road, part of me." Layla felt a chilling cold go through her veins. It wasn't regular cold. It was the cold of death, the cold of an existence that did not belong to this globe. She started to see pictures flickering before her eyes. Old autos stopped on the side of the roadway, scattered skeletons in the surrounding forests, altered faces screaming soundlessly. These were the infinite tourists her grandmother had mentioned. They had not died. They had become trapped. Part of this entity that inhabited the road and the shack. A faint glimmer of hope ignited within her. She remembered her grandmother's other words concerning the light that never heads out in the vacationer's heart. She had not comprehended them after that. Now she started to understand. It had not been the light of the flashlight. It was the light of will, the guts that never quits. Layla felt a chilling cold go through her veins. It wasn't regular cold. It was the cold of death. The cold of an existence that did not belong to this globe. She started to see pictures flickering before her eyes. Old autos stopped on the side of the roadway. Scattered skeletons in the surrounding forests. Altered faces screaming soundlessly. These were the infinite tourists her grandmother had mentioned. They had not died. They had become trapped, part of this entity that inhabited the road and the shack. A faint glimmer of hope ignited within her. She remembered her grandmother's other words concerning the light that never heads out in the vacationer's heart. She had not comprehended them after that. Now she started to understand. It had not been the light of the flashlight. It was the light of will, the guts that never quits. With all her remaining strength, Layla pressed herself. She couldn't free the branches from her feet, but she managed to sit up. With a shivering hand, she reached into her back pocket, where she maintained her automobile trick. It wasn't an average key. It was a tiny keychain with an old silver amulet, acquired from her granny. Her grandma always said it shielded against old wickedness. Layla really did not rely on superstitious notions. However, presently, she wanted to think anything. She threw the silver amulet towards the shadowy entity. As quickly as it touched the air near it, the entity blurted a sharp, painful hiss. The shadows recoiled instantly, as if stung by fire. The amulet had not been strong sufficient to ruin the entity, yet it confused it, deteriorated it for a moment. Layla seized that precious moment. With determined decision, she pushed herself harder. She could not run, however she started to crawl, dragging her body throughout the harsh ground away from the shack. The branches still held her, pulling her strongly towards the shack. However, her will was more powerful. She scraped and pressed with every little thing she had. The shadowy entity began to restore its recognition, murmuring madly, "You cannot leave. You will certainly return." However, Layla didn't stop. She saw something else distant. This moment, not a pale light. However, a flickering red glow. Another auto's front lights. A real twinkle of hope. Trucks didn't pass typically on this barren roadway. However, it was her only opportunity. Layla collected her last remaining toughness and screamed at the top of her lungs, a scream blended with horror and hope. It had not been a scream of despair, however, a scream of defiance, and equally, as the truck's lights came close to, and as the chauffeur started to desperately use the brakes, Layla really felt an effective pull, dragging her towards the shack. The shadowy entity was attempting to pull her right into its depths, but her scream, maybe the flicker of the silver amulet, and most importantly, her undeviating will, were enough. With a cracking sound, the branches twisted around her feet snapped. Layla was up to the ground, tired, barely able to take a breath. But she was totally free. She saw the truck quit close to her and listened to the driver's door open. "My God, are you all right?" An abrupt guy's voice, but loaded with concern. Layla turned to check out the shack. Darkness had actually swallowed it entirely once again. No light, no noise, just a spooky silence, as if what had actually happened was nothing but a headache. Yet the smell of blood and degeneration still stuck around in her nose, and her hand that had actually touched the entity was still unnaturally chilly. She checked out the man that was running towards her, the truck driver with a worn-out face. She said nothing concerning the shack or the shadowy entity. Who would believe her? Layla entered into the vehicle, her body shivering frantically. She looked out the back window as the vehicle repelled from the shack, leaving it behind in the darkness. She really felt something looking at her from the darkness, enjoying her leave. She knew she had made it through, but a part of her would certainly remain on that particular roadway permanently. A part of her heart had been touched by the darkness, which feeling of absolute cold would certainly never disappear. The trip had ended, yet the horror had not. For the roadway, as Layla learned this evening, not just takes you to your destination, yet it can likewise transform you, leaving its mark on you permanently. Layla climbed up into the truck, her body shivering, not just from the cold, but from the echo of the horror that had practically ingested her whole. She really did not speak. The truck driver, a middle-aged male with a thick white beard and worn-out eyes, simply responded. Perhaps he had actually seen sufficient on these roads to know that some things required no description. He started the truck's engine and repelled gradually, leaving the shack and the darkness behind them. Layla gazed out the back home window, attempting to translucent the bulletproof darkness that covered the shack. She really felt something viewing her, a chilly, fixed gaze following her as she pulled away. The shack slowly vanished, blending into the blackness of the night. However, its picture remained engraved in her mind. The dance shadows, the beautiful red eyes, and the smell of decay and blood. Layla didn't sleep that evening. Each time she shut her eyes, the whispers and guttural laughs she had heard returned. The cool hand, the sharp claws. She remained to really feel an unnatural temperature in her appropriate shoulder, where the entity had touched her. It was as if a part of its chill had actually leaked right into her. She came to her mom's and dad's residence at dawn, pale-faced, her eyes red from lack of rest and concern. Her mom hugged Layla tenderly, however observed the modification in her. "What took place, dear? You look like you've seen a ghost." Layla grinned bitterly. "Something like that, Mother. The automobile broke down and I had to walk a little bit." She couldn't tell them the full fact. Just how could any individual believe a story about a shadowy entity populating a deserted road? Days and weeks passed. However, Layla was never ever the very same. Sleep became a distant deluxe. She would suddenly awaken in the middle of the evening to audios only she could listen to, pale murmurs originating from the edges of the space. She began staying clear of dark roads, especially rural ones. Whenever she saw a long darkness or heard a solid gust of wind, she really felt a shudder diminish her spinal column. The silver amulet, which had saved her that night, became her constant companion. She wore it as a pendant around her neck, feeling its cool weight offer her a breakable sense of security. Eventually, weeks after the occurrence, Layla was resting alone in her home, trying to check out a publication. All of a sudden, she really felt an extreme chilly move with the room, despite the fact that the home windows were closed. The lights started to flicker. After that, headed out totally. Darkness returned. However, this time, it had not been absolute. She saw, with distressing clearness, a darkness relocating the corner of the room. It wasn't the entity itself. However, a part of it, a piece of the darkness that had actually clung to her. The voice she knew so well murmured, yet this time around, it was closer, as if inside her head. You left the roadway, Layla, yet the roadway did not leave you. You are now a portal, an area for us. Layla understood the terrible fact. The entity hadn't just wanted to eliminate her or physically imprison her. It desired her to be a part of it, a channel for it in the outdoors. Granny wasn't cautioning regarding dying when traveling, yet regarding merging with it. The everlasting travelers weren't just skeletons. They were spirits that had entered into the entity itself, voices talking via it. Layla gradually climbed, her eyes loaded with misery and bitter understanding. There was no getaway. She was bound to it for life. The entity might not show up completely. However, its presence would certainly continue to haunt her, draining her life bit by bit, until she ended up being simply a vacant shell carrying the burden of the road's curse. Layla looked at the silver amulet around her neck. It had not avoided the wickedness from following her. However, probably it had delayed points. Maybe it was just a symbol of will, a tip that she was still resisting. With each passing evening, the shadow's visibility grew stronger. The cool escalated, and the murmurs expanded louder. Layla was no more alone, but her business was no comfort. She felt the darkness sneaking towards her, not from the outside, however from within. Sometimes she would certainly see flashes of the everlasting travelers' faces appearing in reflections, as if inviting her to her inevitable destiny. Layla had endured fatality on the road. However, she had become part of the road itself, a brand new infinite traveler, condemned to bring the shadow of the shack and the entity that inhabited it any place she went, until the darkness ingested her completely.